So we're going to start by fusing our outer fabric to our fleece. So take your 2 pieces of outer fabric and your 2 pieces of fleece. And, oh, what's my iron doing? It's just being nasty. And then we've got our fleece here with the gluey side looking up. So this is the rough side, that's the soft side. So I'm looking at the glue side. And I get one of my pieces of fabric and I just want to lay the fabric down onto the fleece, lining it all up. Make sure you've got nothing trapped in between the layers that will cause a bump. Make sure it's all nicely lined up. And then you can just press that in place. You can use a pressing cloth if you like to protect your iron. You just need to hold your iron in place for 15 seconds. Move along, hold it for 15. I'm not counting to 15 because that would get really boring for you, but you get the idea. So just very carefully fuse together your outer fabric with your fleece. So these are now well and truly fused in place. The next thing we're going to do is mark out our stitch lines because we're going to add some nice quilt lines to our panel. Now the way that the panel will sit is like this with the handle hole here. So we want the ladies to be facing the right way up here and the right way up here, and they meet in the middle. And we just want those quilting lines to kind of meet at the top here. So I'll mark them on together. So I'll put both of those panels together and then I'll mark my quilting line on with a heat erasable pen, like a friction pen or a fabric pen. Now I think that about 3 centimetres apart looks quite nice, and that does divide into the width here. So I'm going to go for 3 centimetres apart. I'm just going to start 3 centimetres in and draw my lines all the way across. You could do more narrow quilt lines if you like, or wider, it's up to you. And once you've decided on how you want to do those quilt lines, then you can grab a pen, and this one comes off with when you apply heat, so when you apply the iron, and I'm just going to draw some guidelines at 3 centimetre intervals. And it does help to have a quilter's ruler, but if you don't have that, you can either cut yourself a 3 centimetre wide piece of card and use that as a guide just for speed. That's a nice quick way of doing it. Or you could just measure out with a ruler and then join the dots sort of thing. So I've drawn on all of those quilting lines now. So I don't know if you can see those blue lines there. So that's going to help me keep nice and neat as I sew. So I'm going to just sew these lovely lines. It really does give the cover an extra dimension and that beautiful finish that really sets it apart. So I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine now and just stitch along all of these lines. We're ready to start quilting, and I've just put my stitch length to 3 because I think that looks a bit nice to have a slightly longer stitch length. But if you're used to quilting and you prefer sort of 2.6 or something like that, then you can do that. So I've got my blue line here that I've just drawn. I'll start off with a little back stitch, and then I'm just going to carefully follow that line. Now if you find as you are sewing along that your fabric is walking a little bit, just leave your needle down, lift up, smooth everything back, put it back down again, and then continue to sew. If you've got a more high-spec machine, you may find that you've got a quilting feature which just hovers your presser foot slightly. That might be a good idea to use that. Or if you're lucky enough to have a walking foot, then that is also ideal for quilting these lines and to stop your fabric from walking around and bunching up. But I'm just using a regular universal needle. I'm just using my everyday presser foot, and it's working just fine. And this is a very relaxing process, I find. Just sewing these lovely straight lines. Nice and quite meditative. You can just really put some music on that you enjoy. And before you know it, all of these lines of stitching will be complete. As you continue, you're going to get more fabric here in the nook of your machine. So as it gets bigger, you can just roll that up, and then you can flip it round and start sewing from the other side. So I'm going to continue now. I've got quite a few more lines to do, and then I'll show you what the next step is. So there's both my panels, which have been beautifully quilted. If you look at the back, you can see those quilt lines there. So it's much easier to put those pockets on whilst this is just a single piece. So I'm going to work with one of these. You can look at either piece and decide, do you have a favourite? I probably think that one's my favourite. It just looks, the print's in a slightly better placement. So I'm going to use that as the front of my sewing machine cover. So the first thing to do is, if you take your main pocket piece, so the biggest of all of the pockets, and this is the one that is in the contrast lining fabric, and you just want to press that in half, wrong sides together. So nice and easy way to construct this pocket. So we've got that piece folded in half lengthways. And then you just want to lay that on top there, matching up those bottom corners. And then you just want to pop a few clips around the outside edge. And then we're just going to come around and do a stitch around there just to hold that together. So I'm just coming in ever so slightly just to catch the edges there. You may find that with all that quilting, your fabric has been drawn in a little bit. So if the pocket just hangs over slightly at the edge, don't worry. What we can do is just trim that down in a minute. So I'm stopping at the corner with the needle down in the fabric. I'll lift my foot, swivel round, and then continue along that bottom edge there. If I fold that back, you'll see that my pocket fabric just extends a little bit beyond there. And that's just because all that quilting kind of drew the fabric in a little bit. So even though the fabric and the pocket were the same width when we cut them out, that it has shrunk a little bit. So your pocket may be a little wider. That's fine. You can just trim that down afterwards. One more stitch. Finish with a back stitch. So now I'm going to do the same thing with my secondary pocket panel. So just start by folding that in half and pressing it. And then I'm going to line that up with the bottom corner there. And then I'll do the same, and just within the seam allowance, I'll just stitch that pocket in place, just to hold it in place. So once again, I'm just going to sew right on the edge. I've sewn down here, along here and up here, so that is now attached in place, and we're ready to attach our net pocket. Our net pocket is just going to sit on top like this. Before we attach it, we just want to finish off that edge, that top edge, really nicely. So take some of your binding and cut it so that it's longer than the top edge there, just hanging off each end by about 1 centimetre, just to give yourself a bit of wiggle room. And then you want to open up that binding so that the unfolded binding just meets the top edge of the netting there, so you're matching raw edges together. And we're going to sew the binding to the netting along this crease here to begin with, and then we're going to fold it forward to the right side. I'm just sewing along the crease line there and making sure that these raw edges match up at the top. So that's sewn along there. We now want to press and fold that binding up and out of the way. And then once we've done that, we're going to bring it round to the front and fold our binding forward. And you want your binding to sort of fold forward and meet at the other side, so you just have a nice neat bound edge like that. If it won't fold over for whatever reason, then you can just trim away a little bit underneath to help it fold through, but it should quite nicely fold over like that. So hold your binding in place with a few clips, and then you want to change your sewing machine thread colour over to match the turquoise colour. So I've got my machine threaded up with turquoisey colour, and then let's just drop my presser foot, and I'm just going to hand wind my needle down just very slowly. I just want to see that it's just coming onto the edge of that binding there. Little back stitch to begin with, and then just take this line of stitching nice and slowly, because you just want to accurately sew along the edge of that binding there. Just want it to look nice and straight. So that's there, that's all done. You can trim off if the binding just extends beyond your net, you can just trim it off there. And then we're just going to place that onto the front of our machine cover, just there, and then we can just sew that in place just like we did with the original pocket there. So that's all our pockets layered up now. So you can choose which side you prefer. If one side just came out slightly better than the other, that happens sometimes. Going to clip that in place, pin that in place along there. And then put clips along the bottom and at the other side. So just start anywhere along here, because don't worry about your stitches, because they're all going to be covered up in a minute with your binding. And you're just going to stitch that pocket in place along the edge. It doesn't matter which colour thread you use for this bit. So that's all sewn in place. So we've got our panel really starting to take shape. We want to be able to cover up this raw edge here. We'll take a piece of our binding and cut that just a bit longer than we need it. And then that will sit on top of those pocket edges just to cover them up. And then you can just, in fact, if you use your iron, probably is a nice idea, just to fold the top edge of that binding over and give it a nice sharp crease. and then that binding will just trim off any threads that are trying to escape. There we are. Okay, and then we can just hook the binding over the top of the pocket there, because that will give us a nice neat finish all around. So you can see how that going over the top there is giving us a nice clean finish for our end of our pocket. And so what we're going to do is we're going to come back over to the sewing machine. We're going to sew up here, along here, and back down here again. So that gives those pockets a really nice finish. I'll just gently put in a couple of pins all the way through those layers, just to keep that all in place. And then we're ready just to sew around there. So I'm starting at the bottom. Again, just check that my needle is going in right on the edge. Oops, just move it over a little bit. Right on the edge of the binding there. Start with the back stitch. Take that pin out so it's out of the way. Now it's done its job. There we go. I'll get as close as I can to the top there before lifting my foot, swivelling it round, and then stitching across the top there. And then back down I come in the other direction. So our panel is really looking very nice now. We just got these pockets here, but they're full width, and it's quite nice to divide them up. And how you want to divide them up really depends on what you're going to put in them. So you want to be able to fit like maybe rulers, a stitch unpicker, fabric marker pen, maybe your snips, and maybe the sewing machine feet at the bottom here. So I'm going to do 3 pockets. I'm going to line them up with my stitch lines that I did when I quilted my machine cover, because I think that looks nice. And I'm just going to draw the line on there to help me. So what I'll do is I'm going to start at the bottom edge, and I'm going to sew all the way up and stitch through all those layers to divide these pockets into 3 pockets. And what that will do is it will give me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10 pockets all together. So I have lots of pockets for putting all of my sewing bits and pieces. So I'll start sewing from the bottom up to the top, and it's up to you which colour thread you want to use for this. I'm keeping with the turquoise. You could switch over to your white thread or whichever thread colour depending on your fabric that you're using. And then I'll just do another line up here. Oops, make sure that my thread's out of the way. So all of our pockets are now done. So that's our front panel completed. It's a bit of fun, wasn't it, doing all of that? So we're ready to now construct the machine cover itself.